Mm. Hello, everyone. Welcome, Sunday people. Yay.
Wow. Mm,
Mm.
very good to see you all. Something very moving about coming back into the big group. Mm.
Mm. Do you want to look at everyone here before we start? Good. If you don't, fine. Hello, hello.
Mm. So just, yeah, that reminder for everyone, that this is sort of like the coming back together, the joining of several big streams back into the river. We've had a number of people on an intensive silent retreat for the last 10 days at home. A number of people kind of integrated into the world, but joining for a lot of the sittings and talks and offerings, and people who have been fully committed to the world and rejoining us on the Sunday sitting time. Very powerful, actually. Kind of an important ceremonial thing to do, to come back together at the end of a time like this. And in particular, to sort of honor each other's work, people in the world who've been out there, engaged, wrestling with it, cruising through it, pushing it, running from it, whatever you may have been doing. And those yogis doing the hard inner work of all the entanglements that we have and encounter, and how rare it is and how much we can honor that ability and the intention to protect that time, and how important it is also to come together in a good way to bring people back into the world, the outer world, honor that good work. There's friends I have in South Dakota, Lakota friends who, I go and sometimes support their Sundance in the summer ceremony. And sometimes as part of that, and the kind of before the Sundance starts, we'll take people on the hill for their hamblecha, crying for a vision. They call it vision quest. And so people go out, into the Badlands, and they have a little hochaka, a little sacred area, very small, that they're committed to. They're bound in for 2 days, 4 days maximum, where they fast, no food, no water, and just pray, for that time. It's very powerful to, do that ceremony, and powerful to bring people and to bring them back. When you're bringing them out, it's like you're not supposed to talk to them or look at them or touch them. There's an understanding that they're moving into a sacred place. They're becoming kind of sacred beings. And then When it's over and you pick them up, kind of similar. You don't speak to them, you don't look at them directly, you don't touch them. They come covered, back to the camp and have to go into the lodge, the sweat lodge, and the womb to get reborn into this world, into this way of life. It's important, to honor that holy work, that sacred work that happens in the protection, the fasting that we do different, fasting of the heart, not necessarily of food or water, but that understanding that these transitions are important, these places of transition and the coming together back into the community are important to honor, acknowledge, recognize, so that we rejoice in the work that we've all been doing, see how they can support one another, balance each other out into the. We don't have a sweat lodge. We have our Zoom womb. Not quite as good, but it'll do for the times we're in. And this river that we're a part of, river that we're going into, it's a what? A river of karma, river of action. And just these places where those two rivers can convene, it can be very turbulent. Of course, there's a way with all of the sense doors coming together in the present moment. You can think of that as a tinku, as that river coming to the places where the rivers come together and create so much. Hard to find our way through sometimes, hard to get our bearing, be skillful, be safe, not drown, not flail around. And this recognition that we, whether coming off of retreat or coming to a little bit of rest from the world, that we are the inheritors of so much action. There's this flood of fabrication in mind and body that we inherit every moment, right? The results of past action, creating these streams, these rivers, this torrent, and how much responsibility we have, sometimes how much pressure it feels like, how overwhelming it is to recognize that from this point, it's our responsibility. Our karma moving forward is all of our own doing. A beautiful awareness, a powerful burden, a heavy one, but a beautiful one. This morning, I peeling a mango. Folks on retreat heard about some neighbors who given us this incredible gift of like 7 beautiful different varieties of mangoes from their trees. So we've been happily enjoying our good karma from where wherever that came from, and the good karma of our neighbors to be so generous. And it was just pretty powerful. I have a knife that is an old paring knife. It was my grandmother's, my mother's stepmother, who was a Mennonite in Ohio, and was a expert pie maker. when she was in college, she did like domestic work for a family of a doctor near the college, and she had to bake a pie every day for the family. So she was an expert apple peeler. And and my other grandmother on my father's side, was from Ecuador, and she was an expert potato peeler. And so every time I get to peeling fruit or anything, I feel this joy and pressure. uh, because they were very good at it, very frugal, very economical. And even today, I could just tell, I could feel the weight of a kind of encouraging disappointment in my wastefulness of this mango, peeling this mango. Hmm. Mm. And then when I cut it and put it all in, there's the seed, that's that's left. All the parts that you're not gonna cut all of the fruit. Off of the seed. And my dad, um, I have these so many memories. As soon as I started eating it, it's like this weight and joy of how many times, seeing him in my life, kind of leaning over the sink with the mango seed, doing at it, getting all the fruit that he could after having cut, maybe not cutting that well on purpose, so that he had plenty, plenty of fruit left on the seed to chew from. And him saying, when he was a kid in Ecuador, he moved when he was very young to the States, but he, that like his mom would, give him the seed, to chew on. It was like this very young memory. But also when, in his 20s, he went to Cuba for a summer and, worked on construction projects, and learn about the revolution, and that he was able to have these experiences again that he hadn't had since he was a kid, eating all these mangoes and fresh, ripe mangoes, where they're actually grown, not Massachusetts where we got them delayed. Mm. And so just in this one bit of time in the morning, this sense of this karma unfolding me, in the moment of my maternal lineage, my paternal lineage, and the power of that times the overwhelming emotion of that. It's Father's Day today for yogis who are out of sync with that part of the calendar. It- There's a great Leonard Cohen song. He says, "It's Father's Day. Everyone is wounded." uh, that the humor of that, of course, was also my parents were big music buffs, and so the smiling of that. But and then my mother passed away just a few weeks ago, who also felt pressured and perhaps somewhat oppressed by the mm, perfect peeling capacity of her own stepmom or of my grandmother, who she was very close with. This amazing way in which every action, some it's more visceral, some it's more apparent, but when you stop and practice and start to see how much of how we do things, the way we do things, is conditioned, it's habitual, it's from past, it's family, it's practice, it's culture, it's so many things. And those influences on us are amazing, so powerful, some beautiful, some very difficult, but also very important to recognize that they are not totally determinate either. I was reading recently a part of the Abhidhamma canon that's kind of about these points of controversy, points of discussion in the tradition, kind of going back to the first schisms after the Buddha passed away, and within a few hundred years of that, schools with these beliefs and schools with these beliefs. And so this is the sort of Theravada kind of refutation of beliefs that were being built here and there. And one of them was that this idea that everything is karma, which one school held. And so there, of the various refutations of it, there was like, would you say that karma itself is karma? Right? That action is the result of past action. And that's like a fundamentally impossibility in terms of the tradition, in terms of like the whole framework. That karma can create mind states, it can create physical experience, right? That karma has results, action has results, volitional action has results. But a moment of volition is never the cause of a past moment of volition. If there was, there'd be no way out of the cycle, right? It'd mean that everything was just predetermined if all volitional actions were based on past volitional actions. It's not to disregard the sometimes often maybe overwhelming force of conditioning that we have, but that notion is essential, right? That actually in every moment with every new action that we have total responsibility for that choice. And it may be hard to get under the weight of the crashing waves of past action befalling us, but to know that that is a new moment of volition that will have its own moment of effect, impact. It's part of what is so powerful and overwhelming, about this practice and this perspective, and yet the place where there is hope, where there's possibility, where the mechanism of freedom and of change and of liberation comes from. How beautiful that we do have that freedom. How sobering that we have that responsibility. And of course, it's not just our own past actions, our own family, our own community, our own culture, our own. It's like the the amplitude of where all the waves are coming from and the ripples, right, that are impacting us, that affect us. Very powerful. And of course, we're living in times where it feels, for many of us, very volatile. The stakes are very high. The fragility of goodness feels very visceral, in our hearts, our bodies. And in some ways, it's the fragility of the world and the fragility of every moment is visceral, right? And that's something actually important to see, not something to shy from or to deny. It's the heart of the Buddha's teaching, right? Everything is trembling. There is an instability at a fundamental level of all phenomena, of all things. Whether it's you think about it as conceptually the world or just in our so-called self or our experience, right? That nothing is stable for even a moment. There's always change. It's always things are always arising and passing. And sometimes it's the arisingness of them that's exhausting and overwhelming. Sometimes it's the passing of them that's terrifying. The uncontrollability of them. These are important things. They're always true, not just in times that we recognize as volatile. Other times, perhaps certain forces get the upper hand. But that it can be painful in itself, right? The fragility of wholesomeness, of care, of kindness, of generosity, of patience. We see those karmas are also momentary. A moment, an impulse of generosity, an impulse of patience, an impulse of kindness that's beautiful, has its impact. And yet, needs to keep getting churned out. Right? You need to keep committing to it. You need to keep building it so that it starts to build a sense of momentum, right? That goodness feels like it can provide some foundation of security, of refuge, of safety, of stability. Even if we recognize on some fundamental level everything is unstable, momentum is real. Right? The grooves we cut, the channels we dig, these rivers of karma, they're flowing, they're creating a way internally, externally, inner culture, outer culture, right? That word bhavana, we think of as meditation, mind culture, mind cultivation, the way we do things. What is it crafting? What is it cultivating? What is our responsibility, regardless of what we've inherited or the conditions we encounter? It's beautiful quotation that I read some point last week from the Dhamma Sutta. Of karma, I am constituted. Karma is my inheritance. Karma is the matrix. Karma is my kinsman. Karma is my refuge. Whatever karma I perform, be it good or bad, to that I shall be heir. Right? Not just action. Sometimes it's translated as action. The Buddha also was very insistent that he meant intention. Right? The volitional impulse of an action is what gives it the karma, that its character. And of that I'm constituted. That is my inheritance. That is the matrix. That is my kinsman, my refuge. Whatever karma I perform, be it good or bad, to that I shall be heir. And of course, not just personally. Whatever karma we perform, to that we shall be heir. This we know well enough, maybe. So I wanted to offer a little bit of my own, a little more of my own parents. Mm, Something that I feel important that I learned from them that is also relevant to our practice, relevant to the world, and that I think also maybe refined more by the practice and by the Dhamma. And it has to do really with this question of culture. Given that things are fragile, given that there is suffering, given that there is hardship in our own lives and lives around us, in the world around us, what are we called to do? What are we called to generate? What is the karma we want to be a part of, and what do we take responsibility for? And I think they both grew up in times and in internal conditions in which they saw suffering in the world and were motivated, inspired, activated, to confront it, to try to change. And I think like many of us, you know, a lot of that witnessing of injustice or misery, you know, it's because it shakes the deepest desire we have for ourselves or for others or for the world, right? It gets to the core of how unfair things can feel and how unstable things are that they both experienced times of anger, agitation, frustration, hopelessness, despair, overwhelm. Of course, times where that overwhelm was beyond their capacity to feel through, right? They didn't have this Dhamma as a guide. They had other guides, other things that motivated them. But of course, the question of seeing the fragility of existence, seeing the fragility of beings, of well-being, and seeing it threatened, right? The aversion, the anger, the strain that can inspire in the heart, and then seeing the actions that can come from that, right? The desire to confront with violence, right? The desire to oppress those who seem like they are oppressing, uh, to rationalize those behaviors, or those possibilities. And of course, they encountered those in their hearts and their training and their communities of people trying to do good works. But fortunately, they both had very powerful inspirations that were very transformative, I think, in terms of how they decided to go about their efforts for change. So my mom, when she was in high school, somehow and got canceled, and she went to start somehow she ended up at a um, a workshop. This is in Ohio, Cleveland, for the United Farm Workers Union, who were starting their kind of grape boycotts and lettuce boycotts and kind of campaigns across the country on behalf of farm workers, mostly Chicano, Mexican, Filipino, and California, um, where a lot of these farms were, and of course still produce a lot of these products. And so my mom got like totally inspired and swept away by the UFW and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and met Joan Baez. She went out there to California and spent a summer organizing and learning and training and spent some years, then, went to college, but was kind of involved for many years still in the UFW work and the boycotts. I didn't have grape until like I was an adult. We were like weren't allowed to ever eat grapes as a kid. But one of the things that she's learned, there was just how important like culture was, to the movement and music. And there was like a theater troupe and food and potlucks and um, storytelling, art, visual art. It's a pretty good little documentary on the United Farm Workers Union, just the art side of it that just came out. You can stream it somewhere. We watched it recently. Very moving, right? That like you can be fighting against injustice and fighting against so much horrible, really mean-spirited, really awful mentality, but that you didn't want to lose track of your own humanity, and in fact understood that to be a powerful vehicle for human collaboration and organizing. So that was always part of our whole life and childhood. My childhood was music and film and potlucks and lots of meetings. That part wasn't as fun for me, but when there were other kids, it was fun. Mm. And similarly, my dad, at some point when he went to Cuba in 74 or something like that, I think that it really opened up his mind and an awareness of, he came back with all these posters and art. And I read a thing, I've donated a bunch of his posters to this place um, in Brooklyn, the Interference Archive, if anyone ever goes there. It's a bunch of Cuban posters that were my dad's. And they're just beautiful and dynamic and bold. And, that time, like the Soviet Union, they said like a Cuban person said, this isn't the Soviet Union. Like we don't feel like the revolution is threatened by abstract expressionism. You know, this idea that like Soviet, it was like this idea like everything has to be realistic and charged with, the revolution in these sort of like very heavy-handed ways. But in fact, like dancing and music and fun, are actually important to the sense of like there's something worth fighting for, that we want to be cultivating something beautiful, something good in our efforts to assert something good, right? That the process itself should be beautiful, should be enjoyable, should be fun, even if it's hard, you know, not to deny the work of it. So these are like huge influences on my life, growing up. And it's like all this music and um, appreciation for art and appreciation for struggle and story and mm, something that I really do think is fundamental to how we do anything, but especially in terms of how we encounter, oppressive experiences internally or externally. The danger of violence, the danger of hatred, ignorance, greed, not only as a projection of other people in the world, but as we encounter them in ourselves. That there is a sense that we need to also be mm, it's the framework of the practice, right, of dana, sila, and bhavana, that the bhavana work, the work of engaging all of this material, right? Seeing phenomena, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, seeing ourselves craving for it, seeing ourselves reject it, seeing ourselves get involved in self-hatred, seeing ourselves get involved in hatred of others, greedy for experience, dependent on experience. Like this whole thing, it's so hard, it's so powerful, and it can go badly if it's not happening under the protection of like beauty and goodness. And so that is the sense in our practice that it's like we're cultivating the ethical conduct, right? The refraining from harm, right? This commitment we take on retreats or just as yogis in life, as Buddhists, being trying to be so careful with our actions that we don't harm, right? As much as possible. We don't harm based on the tendency towards greed, hatred, or ignorance that we know is still alive in us. So there's like a protective container there, right? And then there's the doing of that which is good, the bringing of beauty into our own lives, into the lives of others, kindness, generosity, being patient with them. But yes, in the world, like art, music, culture, food, right? Gifts, that sense of being pushing forward the goodness, being part of trying to get that stream of goodness going. And that is the only way that it's safe enough to also then practice the bhavana, the mind cultivation, the witnessing, right? The exploration, the seeing how sensitive the heart is, seeing the vulnerability of the present moment, the inherent trembling, the rippling at every sense door and every moment, including the mind and heart. The only way we can bear it or feel enough stability is through the commitment to ethical conduct, the commitment to goodness and kindness, generosity. And that they fuel each other, right? That it's like that goodness, the carefulness creates that protective condition under which you can explore something. And then that exploration refines the motivation for the ethical conduct, refines the motivation for the goodness, so that the generosity is less attached, less expectant of certain outcomes, right? The moral rectitude, right? The uprightness, the clarity, the conviction is more stable, more gentle, more peaceful, right? Not tense, not just a matter of discipline. So it's like the goodness, the sanctuary, the protection provides that possibility of wisdom. And then the wisdom refines the expression of goodness, of morality. And that basic, very simple structure of our retreat container, of our practice, well, there are so many places where that's very powerful and has so much potential, and that we should consider that. There's um, in my village back home in Massachusetts, there's an annual St. Patrick's Day road race, which I never even considered in my entire life that it had anything to do with me. But as someone who has started running a little bit in the last couple of years, begrudgingly, I decided, and that I was home for so many months, helping take care of my mom, and I just needed some other thing. I needed many other things besides just being caretaker. Um, And this seemed like, I'll do that, and it was a 10K, 6 miles. I've never run that far. Anyway, I did it. And there was this, I've only done a few of these like races. I've done shorter ones, but there is something really powerful about being in the middle of the road for however long, right? Where like you're always on the side of the road. As a human walking person, you are on the sidewalk and the cars are in the road. And then here are these moments where they're like, no, we're just going to do things the opposite. And everyone's going to be running in the middle of the road. And to go through my town, where I grew up, and from that perspective, and of course you have people cheering you on and all these other people running for whatever reason were running. Uh, but it's so disorienting and so powerful to say, oh, this is different. The things don't have to, you think things need to be a certain way. You think the structure is just how things are and that we just sort of navigate that. But actually things can be different. We can be doing this in a totally different way, right? Bicycle people have these, right? They claim the roads I don't know. I know these things happen. Cyclists, I can't remember what they're called. The I don't know what it's called, but anyway, it's a thing, right? Um, and you see there's something very powerful in that. I have a friend from college, and it's so cool. I know we went to school in St. Paul, Minnesota, and every May Day, there has been for many years, I know there was a little break, this May Day parade in the Seward neighborhood of Minneapolis. And it's like, I'd never seen anything like that. I have St. Patrick's Day parade in my town, and it's like, what, it's like a parade that you think of with like batons, right? The May Day parade in Minneapolis is amazing. It's just like huge puppets, and it's all these like community organizations and rabble rousers and anarchist bicycle makers like driving these crazy bikes, and it's so cool. And then at the end of it, used to end up at this park, and they had like a big ceremony, and it was about the ending of winter and the coming of spring with these giant puppets. So I remember the first time I was like, I've never seen anything like this. This is the most amazing thing in my entire life. And this friend of mine who also was inspired by it, though she had more experience with the bread and puppet people up in Vermont, who started a lot of that type of thing. Um, she now lives in Portland and just created this uh, parade that is now going to be an annual parade in Portland called the Everything Under the Sun parade, which was yesterday was the second annual one. And it's a small version of the same beautiful thing of like handmade puppets that she's learned how to do, and she does classes and people come out, and there's the little ukulele band, and there's it's just like a community festival that is, again, it's like takes over the streets for a day. And how amazing and joyful and inspiring and beautiful that is, to have this transformation within the structure of like, oh, things don't just have to be the way we think they are. And of course, we're living in a time of protest and manifestations in the world, and like, of course, those are also times where they can be similar experiences, where it's like, oh, the relationship between people and infrastructure and buildings and streets, and it's like it can be different, and that there's times, of course, where that can be scary, and where there's the comma of that can go in many different directions. But the sense of also where it's like, that it can generate so much goodness and so much camaraderie and unified sense of belonging and care and expressions of that. And that this practice, it's like mind body, we think we're in this little sort of just like, can feel like a prison, can feel like the structure and the dynamic of those relationships is like very rigid. And yet here we have this way of like exploring it, right? Through this cultivation of protection, of goodness, of kindness, of all the beautiful things. And then there's times where it's like you can feel so free in the body, free in the mind. How different, what a relief that is. And even if those are impermanent, that when I was in college, it was kind of this notion of the temporary autonomous zone, right? It was like, don't worry about permanent revolution. You're just worried about like, you make a space that's free for a little while and you expect it to fall apart. You expect it to dissipate. But that sense of freedom is something that like is powerful, right? That stays with you. You get a taste of that and you want to create it again. You want to help other people feel it. And there's a momentum that builds in that. Something very similar in terms of the practice. Just like a little bit of freedom, a little taste of ease, not having to make everything stop, not having to make everything go away, but actually within the flood of experience, within the truth of things, within the trembling, there's ease. There's access to patience, kindness, compassion. And that is fundamental. I would say the thing that I feel like is so well understood in the tradition is that you have to maintain a relationship with the trembling, right? It's like this is if you just cultivate loving kindness, you just cultivate compassion or the Brahma Viharas, it's beautiful, it's good, it's understood to be good, and you're creating a beautiful momentum in the world. But it doesn't necessarily lead to wisdom. It doesn't necessarily lead to more transformative change in a stable way, because we have to see that that is also impermanent. The generation of kindness, of goodness, it just lasts a moment and dissipates. It lasts a moment, it dissipates. And you can build a sense of powerful momentum, right? And security in that, which has to be used for deepening that relationship with the truth. Because otherwise it just collapses and it's just disappointment, because it can't always be maintained. Right? There has to be some place of letting go and acceptance of the truth of things are out of control, things are impermanent, things are in flux. But that stability and that goodness can be used to come into that awareness in a safe way, right? It gives us a strength and the platform from which we can dive into the truth and bear the tumultuousness of reality. And again, that wisdom of the truth of things influences the way that we're creating goodness, the way that we're creating kindness, that we're not desperate for it. We're not fixated on it as thinking that it's permanent or that it's the permanent solution, right? It's understanding that it's good. It is good. And the goodness is good. And that we want to be a part of it. But that it also, there is a stability that isn't threatened by reality, right? That isn't surprised at the way the world is. That isn't shocked at every moment of bad news or misbehavior that we witness. Because the wisdom is understanding action and the consequences of action, right? The consequences of moral action, the consequences of immoral action, the inheritance of that for all of us as individuals and as a world. And so we see misery and we feel compassion for it, but we're not surprised by it. Right? Of course, this is the way things are. We look at what created it. This is of course, this is what happened, right? You look what happened before that, before that, before that. Like, of course, this is the world we've created. Of course, this is the world we bear. There's not a trembling in the face of the trembling. There's an understanding of the nature of things, not shocked, still horrified, and of course, compassionate, of course, moved to be skillful and encourage skillful things. So, this very tall order, which is to stay sensitive to the vulnerability and the nature of things, and to be careful about succumbing to the tendencies to get unsensitive through aversion, through aggression, through anger, through violence, through clinging and craving and grasping and addiction, through denial, and to not feel like the victims of sensitivity either, right? To not only feel like we're oppressed by reality, right? There is that aspect of the truth, right? It's like this sense of the basis of the Four Noble Truths. There is misery, there is suffering. This is the cause of suffering. See it externally, see it internally. Greed, hatred, ignorance. You can get that. Appreciate the clarity of that in our world. And appreciate when we're clear about that internally. Times of clarity are painful, but the clarity is good. Oh, this is the cause of misery. This is the cause of stress. And hopefully, at some moments in our practice, the cessation. Well, a huge range of what that can mean, from enlightenment to just the dissipation of anxiety, of worry, without picking up that hot stone again. Things dissipate on their own. We don't even need to get rid of them. It's our entanglement that ends up breathing life back into so much of what causes suffering. So that sense of like, staying sensitive, staying tender, staying fragile, staying close to that fragility, and yet getting strengthened by the truth. And finding love, finding generosity, finding goodness, also not as a way to defend against the truth, but as a way to deepen our understanding of it, deepen our appreciation of the power of it, deepen our understanding of responsibility and possibility. So we're not crushed by reality. With when the world is collapsing, this is something that strengthens our faith. Period. This is what we expect. This is the nature of things. This is the nature of greed, hatred, and delusion. It's the nature of phenomena. And so then what, right? What does that mean? And then what does it give us access to in terms of kindness, in terms of care? Not because we can't bear the truth, but because we really fathom it and understand that's the only reasonable response. This little book of aphorisms by Franz Kafka, the last thing I think he wrote. This is a short one. he uses he gendered, and I'm not gonna retranslate it. Whoever renounces the world must love all people, for he also renounces their world. He thus begins to gain a sense of the true nature of man, which cannot be anything other than loved. Whoever renounces the world must love all people, for they also renounce their world. They thus begin to gain a sense of the true nature of people, which cannot be anything other than love. It's a beautiful expression of that relationship between renunciation and love. Maybe confusing on some level to the mind and heart, but very pure on another. Mm. The one song, I grew up with much music. One song that I'll just read to close with. It's very beautiful, important. Both my parents love this. Made famous mostly by Mercedes Sosa, but written by Leon Greco. I'll read the English translation. Solo le pido a Dios. I only ask of God. I only ask God that pain doesn't make me indifferent, that the dry death doesn't find me empty and alone without having done enough. I only ask God that injustice doesn't make me indifferent, that they don't slap my other cheek after that claw has scratched this fate. I only ask God that war doesn't make me indifferent. It's a huge monster that tramples all the poor innocence of the people. I only ask God that deceit doesn't make me indifferent. If a traitor can do more than any number, that those number do not forget him easily. I only ask God that the future doesn't make me indifferent. Hopeless is he who has to go and live a different culture. I only ask God that war doesn't make me indifferent. It is a huge monster that tramples all the poor innocence of the people. The sense of staying close to that vulnerability, right? Pleading to not get indifferent to the fragility of life and the misery, the suffering of existence in ourselves and in humanity, but also to take responsibility for our part in what we generate internally and in the world. So thank you all. Thank you for sharing in this beautiful Kama current river that we have, trying our best, cultivate goodness, protect ourselves and each other from harm, and deepen this capacity for wisdom and growth of true compassion, kindness. So take care, everyone. As you move along into the stream, we will close with the retreat folks. We'll close in 1 hour with the metta chanting and sitting. And then we'll hopefully see everyone again next Sunday. Take care.